Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's event organized by the Council on Geostrategy, the newest foreign affairs think tank based in the heart of London and dedicated to making the United Kingdom, as well as other free and open nations, more united, stronger, and greener. And we are absolutely delighted to host this special event tonight. This evening is dedicated to the book launch, the book called The British Way of War, which is written by Professor Andrew Lambert, one of the greatest professors of naval history in the UK, and I dare to say around the globe, who is also our advisory council member. In his newest book, Professor Lambert shows how, as a lawyer, civilian and liberal, Julian Corbett brought a new level of logic, advocacy, and intellectual precision to the development of strategy. Corbett skillfully integrated classical strategic theory, British history, and emerging trends in technology, geopolitics, and conflict to prepare the British state for war. He emphasized that strategy is a unique national construct rather than a set of universal principles, and recognized the importance of domestic social reform and the evolving British Commonwealth. And tonight we have a fantastic opportunity to explore the topic of the book and have a wider conversation about British naval power and strategy with Professor Andrew Lambert, Professor Alessio Patellano, Captain Dr. Kevin Rowlands, and James Rogers. And I would like now briefly to introduce each of our panelists. Professor Andrew Lambert is Lord and Professor of Naval History at the Department of War Studies at King's College London, where he directs the Lawton Naval Unit. He is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and he also received the 2014 Anderson Medal for his book, The Challenge, Britain Against America in the Naval War of 1812. Another famous book is Sea Power States, which won the 2018 Gilder Lehrman Book Prize in Military History. Since March 2021, he has also been a member of the Advisory Council of the Council on Geostrategy. We are also joined tonight by Professor Alessio Patellano, who is a professor in war and strategy in East Asia and security director at King's Japan Program. From 2006 to 2015, he was visiting professor in strategy at the Italian Naval War College in Venice. And in Japan, Professor Patellano has been a visiting professor at the Japan Maritime Command and Staff College. We are also absolutely delighted to be joined by Captain Dr. Kevin Rowlands, who is the Director of Royal Navy Strategic Studies Centre. Captain Dr. Kevin Rowlands joined the Royal Navy in 1990 and has served for 31 years. He is the author of Naval Diplomacy in the 21st Century, and since September 2021, he has been the head of the Royal Navy Strategic Studies Centre, which is tasked with informing policy and strategy decisions by harnessing the intellectual capital of academia, think tanks, and Royal Navy personnel. And we are also joined by James Rogers, who is a co-founder and director of research at the Council on Geostrategy. He specializes in geopolitics and British strategic policy, and he has also held multiple positions at the Baltic Defence College and the European Union Institute for Security Studies. Without any further delay, I would like to quickly note a couple of housekeeping rules. So our panelists will speak for about 45 minutes, and the second part of the event will be dedicated for our Q&A session with the audience. You can ask your questions during the whole course of the event, but please do make sure that you indicate your name, your surname, your affiliation and organization, and to whom you are addressing your question. So without any further delay, Professor Andrew Lambert, we are very much looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. It's a great pleasure to be with you this evening and to have an opportunity to talk about my new book and also to reflect on the intertwined lives of a big idea and a great thinker. This book started as a biography of Julian Corbett, but I quickly realized that to write about the man without the context would lose much of the value. Corbett makes far more sense in context. Strategists don't operate in a vacuum. They don't write for some imagined country. They write for something they understand. So to know Corbett and to know the world he lives in is critical to understanding the ideas that he's putting forward, and especially his responses to the catastrophe of the First World War and his attempts to rescue national strategy from the chaos of the Western Front. So in many ways, this is a book with two themes, a life and an idea. Corbett himself, born in 1854, was the son of a wealthy London-based property developer. His family circumstances accelerated from modest middle class to landed gentry in the course of his childhood. The family moved into a very large house in southwest of London, Imber Court, now the Metropolitan Police Training Academy in Thames Ditton. He grew up, went to school late to Marlborough, which was then a forcing house for Trinity College, Cambridge. He went to Cambridge, he took a law degree, he secured a first-class law degree. This is early on in the history of law degrees at Cambridge. He qualified at the bar and practiced as a barrister. But when his father died, he retired from the bar, took over running the family estate, and began publishing novels. He was a writer from a very early age. His travel journals from his teenage years and his early 20s are beautifully written and show striking insight, qualities that will dominate his writing going forward. Why is Corbett writing? He believes that men of his class and education have a social responsibility to take part in the big debates of the age, the future of Britain, the future of the empire, something that will dominate much of his thinking later. He's a progressive liberal, and unlike so many strategic writers, he's never worn a uniform. He's thinking about change and progress, not stasis. He's thinking from a social and political rather than a military background, which invests his thinking with qualities that we don't find even in some of the best of his contemporaries, like Alfred T. Mahan, who is very much a uniformed man and a product of a military education system. In some ways, the difference in their ideas is very much down to their backgrounds. One British, one American, one civilian, and one military. He serves in local government. He's a member of the Liberal Party. He's 3 times nominated to stand for Parliament, but he doesn't take up that offer. That's not going to be his forte. His brother is an MP in the early 20th century. His family wealth means that he has the luxury of doing whatever he wants to do. So everything that he does in the period of his mature work is done because he believes in the service he's providing, and he thinks it's his social duty to provide it. This is not a man who's looking for wages at the end of the week. This is a man who believes in his mission. And as a result, when he works with high-powered individuals like Admiral Lord Fisher, key cabinet ministers, he is not echoing what they want to hear. He is writing his own ideas. He turns down invitations to write on many occasions because he does not support the issue that he's invited to write on. He remains at the heart of national culture. He lives in central London, in Knightsbridge, from the late 1890s. His friends include Henrik Ibsen, the playwright, Mark Twain, Arthur Conan Doyle. He was a war correspondent with Conan Doyle in the Sudan in 1896. Later in life, Edward Elgar, the great composer, is one of his closest friends. And throughout much of his life, the great artist Sir William Richmond is his best friend. He moves in literary, artistic, and cultured circles. He is not restricted to the world of military ideas. He is also a leading Edwardian historian. He is one of the founders of the modern historical discipline in Britain, and he is the first to get military history in its broadest sense onto the curriculum of international historical scholarship. One of the lost parts of his career is his work to bring military and naval history to the 1913 International Congress of Historical Sciences. Not only does he create that opportunity, but he makes sure the lectures are given in the Royal United Services Institution, and the chairman of all of the lectures is a senior military or naval officer. He gets the military across the road from the War Office and the Admiralty in to preside over a historical event. He's bringing history to the service of the Navy. He is not taking the Navy into the service of history. So history is a tool that will help the Navy develop and expand its ideas and create opportunities for fresh thinking. So his British way of war is capturing and processing the strategic heritage of Britain, understanding what worked in the past and what didn't. Where did the British find success, and where were they learning lessons that needed to be avoided in future? So it's very much an evolutionary process. And in this work, he's heavily influenced by the best and brightest defense intellectuals in late Victorian Britain, who happen to be soldiers. While most of the soldiers are thinking about the continent, Colonel G.F.R. Henderson and General Sir Frederick John Morris, both teaching at the Camberley Staff College, are acutely aware that British military needs are not continental. So the German model is not appropriate to British needs. A German way of war is good for Germans. It is not much use to the British, who are not on the continent and do not have a mass conscript army. Both of these men read Clausewitz into English, and Corbett will do the same. His great contribution is the way that he grasps Clausewitz's brilliant theoretical understanding of war and develops it for a British context. He is not a follower of Clausewitz, he's an interpreter. Like all great intellectuals, he takes these ideas and he works them into something rich and strange, which fits better the context in which he's operating. From 1902 onwards, he is the academic leader of the Royal Navy's War Course program, senior officer training and education, preparing the men of the Edwardian Navy for the future. He will teach pretty much every naval officer of any rank who features in the First World War. Many of them become close personal friends, including John Jellicoe and David Beatty, to name but a few. Oh, and Rosalind Weems as well, who was first Sea Lord at the end of the war. He knows everybody in the establishment. He knows everybody who is inside the Admiralty building. He is working in a very pressurized world. He's also a key member of the Committee of Imperial Defense Official History section, which he will run from 1914 until his death in 1922. He will oversee the entire official history project for Britain in that period. Not only does he write the strategic grand narrative, but he selects the authors and commissions the texts that need to be published. He is overseeing the entire project. If you've ever wondered why the operational history of the army volumes of the First World War are so dull, that's deliberate. The grand strategy of the British Empire is maritime. It's all in Corbett's naval operations text. The army is restricted to tactical and operational matters, leading to some very long and remarkably uninteresting texts. But he's segueing the maritime into strategy by bringing on board maritime trade. Charles Fales' volumes on maritime trade, Hurd's volumes on the merchant navy. These are critical contributions, understanding that war is not just fought by fighting services, that without global sea control and a global merchant navy, Britain could not have won the First World War. He's exceptional in other ways. When he works for Admiral Sir John, later Lord Fisher, this is a meeting of minds. Two liberals who believe that progress is essential and that the rigid conservative values of much of the officer corps need to be overridden, and that a wider base of recruitment is required to find future Nelsons, as Fisher would put it. It's Corbett who writes the high-level papers that publicly set out Fisher's agenda, first for officer education and reform, but then for the technological breakthrough of Dreadnought and the wider policy within which it operates, and finally for the legal basis of blockade strategy. Corbett is writing into the record a vision of how Britain will fight the First World War. And in 1911, he publishes some principles of maritime strategy, a classic Clausewitzian-infused text, which is often misunderstood. This is a quasi-official doctrine pamphlet. It says Britain as a country, not the Royal Navy as an organization, has a strategy which is maritime. This means that the main job of the army is to support the Navy in securing, maintaining, and exploiting command of the sea for economic and strategic advantage. It was published after being read and approved by the first Sea Lord. Corbett understood that this could not be published unless the Admiralty approved of it. The first Sea Lord in question was not Jackie Fisher. He'd retired by then. It's Admiral Sir Arthur Wilson. And Wilson would use Corbett's arguments in defending the Admiralty against attacks from many directions, principally the army. So Corbett's contention is this: the British way of war is sea control based on naval dominance, the exploitation of maritime advantage, amphibious power projection, and the use of limited rather than total methods of war to secure Britain's interests in the European theatre, which are negative interests. Britain is not seeking to conquer Europe. It is not seeking to acquire European territory. It is seeking to maintain a balanced European state system in which no one power will dominate. This was the balance that the British struck in the wars with France under Louis XIV and Napoleon. It is the balance they will strike in the wars with Germany in the 20th century. When the war broke out in August 1914, Corbett was just finishing an official account of the Russo-Japanese War, which had many lessons to teach the British for this conflict, but arrived just too late. During the war, he would not only provide high-level policy papers, he wrote much of Maurice Hankey's intellectual output, but he will also be developing the narrative of the conflict as a strategic lesson. The purpose of his book is to make sure that when the war is over, the Royal Navy has access, and the rest of Britain has access to a strategic analysis which explains what had worked, what had not worked, and what should never be done again. It's fairly clear which direction he was going in. Britain began the war by clearing up the outer world, closing down Germany's access to the rest of the world, securing control of the North Sea, and it should then have pushed on and opened up the Baltic and completed the blockade of Germany in the middle of 1916. Corbett wrote the paper that Jackie Fisher used to push that concept through the cabinet in early 1915. Unfortunately, Fisher was unable to secure cabinet consent to carry it through and resigned. But Corbett's views of strategy were evolving constantly. In 1920, he was talking to T.E. Lawrence in his flat in Knightsbridge over dinner, and the two men were clearly on the same page of the hymn sheet. They both disapproved fundamentally of the way the soldiers had waged war. They were great fans of Admiral Sir Rosslyn Weems, who had been a key supporter of the revolt in the desert and then the mastermind of bringing the war to an end. Had Corbett lived to write that book, which would have been the fourth volume of his naval operations, he would have put forward Lawrence as an example of a proper method of British war. Not too many soldiers on the ground, great deal of maritime power projection. And then when the war ended, Corbett had to fight two great battles, first with Churchill and then with David Beatty, both of whom tried to block his book because it didn't show them in a very good light. And history has confirmed that they deserved not to be shown in a very good light. He won those battles, but the cost on his health was considerable, and I'm sure it contributed to his early death in 1922. But Corbett wasn't finished. He went back to teach the Navy after the war on the now renamed Naval Staff Course. He pushed ahead with the development of academic history, playing a key role in establishing the Institute of Historical Research in the University of London for postgraduate students. He was running the Navy Records Society, the organization that provided a lot of historical material interpreted to help develop doctrine. And his ideas, which he'd formulated during the war, were already becoming clear, and he transmitted them to his great friend, Captain later Admiral Sir Herbert Richmond. And it's from Richmond that the British way of war descends through a variety of British experts. First, Basil Liddell Hart, who was essentially a journalist, and was then challenged in the post-Second World War world by men like Professor Sir Michael Howard, who adjusted the realities of the Cold War. With the British Army on the Rhine, the British way of war didn't look like Corbett thought it did for Sir Michael, and he challenged that British way, and we ended up with the British way written up as if Britain's main role in the world was fighting continental military conflicts. If this book can reverse that trend and get people to challenge that assumption, it will have done a great deal to put us back on the proper lines. The First World War and the Cold War deployments of the army in Germany are the exception, not the rule. They are not the model to follow, they are the example to avoid. This is the point that Corbett is making. His work is ultimately about one simple thing. Britain is a unique and distinct strategic operator. It can take ideas from other strategic cultures, but its own strategic culture is unique and distinct, and it is only fully understood by bringing together strategic analysis, historical example, and the latest thinking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lambert, for guiding us through your book. And we are now looking forward to hearing from Professor Alessio Bertolano.
Victoria, thank you so much for the very kind introduction. I've just realized that I am in that sort of relatively strange position of finding myself commenting and reflecting upon the work of my supervisor, and which is a rather sort of difficult situation because usually that would be the other way around. He would be sort of looking over stuff that I have written. Nonetheless, I'll try to raise this challenge and perhaps sort of provide a few initial thoughts and reactions as someone who's been engaged with the work that ended up in this book over the years, but also seen the ideas and sort of the growth, the intellectual growth of this book over the years. If ever there was a conversation to have about strategic thinking and the extent to which different countries, or the experience of different countries as it is embodied by writers, authors, and practitioners, sort of come together to provide what is de facto a rather sort of unique intellectual construct set of ideas and principles. Certainly this book provides that picture insofar as Britain is concerned, placing Julian Corbett at the center. It's a point of convergence, of reflection, if you want, of a long-standing experience, and trying to distill that to a contemporary audience, that audience that is in the early 20th century, that is wrestling first with managing a large empire, and then avoiding war in Europe, and then managing and overcoming that war. So in that sense, it's a fascinating story. And even though the book is quite, it's quite robust in terms of number of pages, the narrative flow naturally. It's very engaging because every moment of his life, as Andrew would say, Julian Corbett's life is in a way a mirror it's a window into Britain, into a very challenging and difficult period of time, and a window into someone that is at the center of different networks and is tirelessly working in trying to link practitioners and academics. In that sense, Corbett's story, it's one that is extremely relevant today. And it's relevant today for three reasons. And this is, for me, really one of the core elements that I take away from the book. It's not a history book in the sense that it's an in-depth examination of the life and the importance and the impact of this man. It is also a book that tells us something extremely important about history as a discipline. History is always the reflection of a particular present. And the present affects the framework, the lenses that we use to examine the past. Corbett is if you want, is the vessel that is carrying that interpretation and ferrying it from one point to another. And in that sense, that task has not changed, and it continues to be particularly relevant today. So even though it is a story about Corbett and the challenges of Britain in the early 20th century, it is also a story about the present, and it is a story that is extremely relevant to how academia and strategic analysts, as it were, or today would be think tanks like the Council on General Strategy, the absolutely essential role that they had in using a variety of tools. It so happens that Corbett's tool is history and Britain's own past in order to inform a debate in the present. So if there's one thing that I would definitely take away, it's not just a history book, that is extremely pleasant to read because of the value of the story that it tells. But it's also a book that is relevant in terms of engaging and understanding. If you want, Corbett's life is almost a guide to understand how to try to navigate the challenge of using analytical thinking to inform policy debate. And that comes also with the very sort of honest and refreshing take on the fact that, you know, notwithstanding lots of very good ideas that Corbett has, not all of them end up being part of a policy choice, the consequences of which, particularly in the case of World War I, are absolutely tremendous. So the first thing is this link between the value of the story as a history story, but also the value of its contemporary relevance as a method to engage academic thinking for the use of policy. Within this context, if I were sort of to try to link some specific notions that we use and we wrestle with today, and specific parts of the book, so specific themes in the book, I would probably make 2 points. And these points unfold or are sort of a reflection of the way I would imagine correlating to a very present debate, a debate that is informed by the recent integrated review that was conducted by the government, which in many ways is a very Corbettian piece of work in the way Andrew presents it into this book. And the 2 points that I will sort of link this to are the notion of convening power, which is presented in the integrated review as one of those unique assets that the UK has in terms of bringing coalition of partners together to address practical issues that undermine the international order that is essential for prosperity to continue to be built and pursued according to liberal values. Corbett's work that Andrew talks about regarding the Sea Commonwealth, how the British Empire by 1916, Corbett is wrestling with the question, how should the British Empire evolve? One of the ways in which he's thinking about it is this idea of moving, using the dominions to sort of reinvent British relationship with them, and really using the sea as this platform that creates a network, that link them together in a way to transform the empire into, if you want, a network-based alliance or a commonwealth, as he talks about it, that really sort of uses the ocean as the fundamental glue that holds prosperity together through connectivity. Now, that notion is absolutely, purely 100% contemporary relevance. And I think the story of, in a way, how Corbett is coming at this in the early 1910s is absolutely brilliant, because fast forward to the 2020s, we are in a place in which this idea of convening power as a way to sort of mobilize like-minded partners to ensure that international orders renews itself and places maritime connectivity at the heart of it, absolutely couldn't be more relevant than anything else, really. And the second point that I would probably want to emphasize is this idea of that he talks when he talks about the Sea Commonwealth, is this sort of orientation towards an emphasis on partnerships, which speaks to how military capabilities are a function of a national strategy, which is based on the ultimate objective, which in Corbett's case is the transformation of the British Empire to ensure the continuation of British, if you want, standing internationally and British wealth, right? And in that sense, Corbett is really very much presenting a counterpoint to the emerging sort of other big naval power by 1916, or at least what Corbett sees as the other emerging naval power, the United States, which is looking at international order through the lenses of capabilities, through the lenses of ordering, not as something that is built around values that link us together, but rather hard metrics, hard material capabilities as the sort of benchmark against which this sort of ordering principles are set. Corbett is very aware of the fact that the whole idea of the Sea Commonwealth is designed to shift the debate away from one that is purely based on national capabilities and more on national outputs of national security. What is the ultimate objective that we're trying to achieve? What are the best ways to do it? Corbett is aware that Britain will not be able to sustain it alone. So the mobilization of the Dominion, focusing on partnership or networking partnerships, becomes a central theme. This is very different, in Corbett's view, from how the Americans are thinking about that. And Corbett is very much sort of keen on trying to avoid it thinking. Now, in a broader sense, if you place this story into how sort of Andrews articulates Corbett's engagement with Britain's problem, speaks to, if you want, another sort of notion deployed in integrated review, which is this notion of integrated. This isn't just about capabilities. This is not just about hard metrics and guns on guns kind of assessments. This is about how mobilizing different tools of statecraft contributes to achieve the objective of your national strategy. So in that sense, there is an incredible sense of refreshing being contemporary in Corbett writing, because Corbett is talking about how Britain over the centuries had engaged by using finance, telecommunication, sea lanes communications, deterrence, different tools to achieve its objectives. It's not just about pure national capabilities. It is about placing these capabilities in the service on a broader sort of if you want, strategy. And within this context, therefore, he's very sort of articulating this idea of the Sea Commonwealth on the back of that sense of disappointment that comes with the continental commitment and the risk that it brings about in completely shifting the focus of attention and creating false assumptions about commitment to security means X number of troops in this particular place. But a particular point that, as Andrew was highlighting, will continue to remain in the British debate long after World War I is finished. So, to wrap things up, why do I think it's a brilliant book? Well, first of all, because Andrew wrote it, but that's, that would be a bit of a foregone conclusion. What is brilliant about it is that not only is it a great standalone piece of history writing, but it's also almost a guidebook on how to link the use of the past as a tool to inform contemporary policy debate. It's a guide into a method of analysis and a method of understanding, one in which there's four things that really should strike any reader. One is the center stage of a particular worldview. Corbett's worldview is absolutely strikingly different from most of the commentators of his time. Is liberal in a way, really is trying to set Britain's connectivity not just to a particular space, but in that global emerging world system that was at the beginning of the 20th century. So in that sense, it remains extremely relevant to today. And the second point is that in that particular worldview, the sea has a central role in international affairs. Okay, this is a second point that is of great relevance because in integrated review and in many of the international sort of geopolitical questions of today, the sea keeps coming back in different forms as a central aspect. Number three, I like very much this idea that capabilities are not the leading factor of a conversation, but should be sort of debated on the back of a broader conversation of the priorities of national securities and a broader understanding of what the best tools to pursue these are, of which capabilities are one element. And within that, the distribution across the different domains become part of the conversation. And lastly, if a worldview in which the sea is central and capabilities are part of a national security conversation, then the fourth point is this idea that if the sea is central not just as an ordering principle, but also as part of the answer to that national security question. It brings about this idea of networking your own assets with those of your partners and mobilizing, working with partnership and alliances as an inherent component of how you find a solution to the ultimate question of a balance within a national security strategy. For that reason, I could not commend more the book and certainly would recommend everybody to buy it as soon as this talk is finished. If not, don't worry, you can do it now and come back later. Thank you very much. Look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Professor Bertolano, for your remarks. And now over to Captain Dr. Kevin Rowlands.
Thank you. I'm not sure there's anything left to say after Andrew and Alessio have both spoken, but I'll give it a go and see how far I get. So the first thing I want to say is that in prepping for this, only at about 17:45 this evening, I thought I'd better do due diligence and make sure I'm up to date. I've looked at the book, but let's go to that resource whose name should never be spoken. So I did a quick Wikipedia search of Corbett to see what was going on, and to my surprise and horror, Wikipedia hasn't yet caught up with the fact that Andrew's book is out. So on the Corbett page, it mentions nothing that I can see about the British Way of War, which I think is a damning indictment on the speed of the internet, and it needs to catch up, because I have absolutely no doubt that this will become the definitive text on Julian Corbett. The second thing I was going to say is that when I was reading it over the past week or two, I was scribbling notes because I wanted, of course, to remember things for this conversation. And at one point, I started photographing the pages and tweeting little bits out to see what comment I got. I did one section. It was talking about the war course in the Edwardian period, and Andrew had said something and named them and put some numbers next to the fact, and somebody answered my tweet and said, I think you'll find that Lambert is wrong in this. It wasn't 253, it was about 252 or something, and such a text shows where it is. I didn't respond to the challenge, and the reason is because I thought that individual may challenge Andrew Lambert on Julian Corbett. I couldn't possibly dare to do that. Andrew is the renowned authority on Corbett, which I think that is one of the reasons, if not the main reason, why this is the definitive text today. And if we want to find out about the man, his work, and its applicability to today and the future, then this is a place to start. So I, like Alessio, I absolutely commend it to everyone. However, I'm not a Corbett expert, and I'm not a historian. I like to think in terms of concepts and strategy. I have been a naval officer, and so I'm interested in the second part of the title, you know, the British Way of War. So I think that, like anyone, and historians amongst us will see underlying context and natural biases in the works of everyone. I think that the work of any writer is a product of the individual, and Corbett was a product of his position, his privilege, the context of the world he was living. So he was a product of his time. And so I wonder how much of that, of course, is seen throughout his writing, and Andrew points out extremely well in the book. You know, he was a liberal, he was a lawyer, he was a novelist, he was a great writer, he was well connected, he was an imperialist. How much of that is the underlying pinning of his work, some principles and others, and therefore how much of it is truly applicable in today's world that is very, very different, and Britain's place in it, I think, is very, very different. So the question I would pose, and I won't completely answer, maybe we can come back to this train of thought in discussion, is the worldview that sits quite well today, perhaps, with post-Brexit Britain, of a global trading nation, of a global Britain, of going back out into the world on the seas, which on the face of it may appear to be very Corbettian. Is that actually true today? Can we describe that as the foundation of a British way of war? Are Corbett's principles enduring? Is Corbett's view of the world enduring? Or is the fact that we no longer have a Pax Britannica, we no longer have the world's preeminent navy, is that more important? I think Alessio's points are extremely telling and apt. I think I agree with pretty much everything that he said about from the integrated review and the world as we see it. We are, of course, still maneuverist and not attritional. I like Andrew's discussion, particularly in the introduction, about T. Lawrence and T. Lawrence's adventures in the Middle East in World War I being far more aligned to a British way of war than the fighting on the Western Front. And I think we can all see that. But what of today? I think that today we are more internationalist than imperialist. We certainly favour manoeuvre over mass. We favour partnership over hegemony. We're certainly a convening power, and we certainly follow an agenda that today, I think, in the national security strategy, in our national security objectives, we'd put down to prosperity. We describe as prosperity. So we are a nation that still looks at the world in that way, and still like to see itself, I think, on the global stage in that way. When it comes to war, are we the leading power or a supporting power? And I just wonder if the history of the late 20th century and the early 21st is one more of us in that supporting role, because I think much of our strategy and much of our strategic thinking has been informed not by the academic community and the think tanks of Britain, but by our friends and allies over the Atlantic. I'm not going to turn this around to be anything about my organization, except to say, where do we find the Julian Corbett of today, or how do we bring those ideas that may be fresh and novel and inform how we make our policy and strategy decisions in the world today? Because I don't think we can continue following our great friends and partners forever. We need to have a foundation, an underpinning of British thinking. And I think that Alessio mentioned that Corbett, many of Corbett's ideas didn't find themselves translated immediately into policy. They informed policy decisions, but some of them weren't taken on and were dropped. And of course, that comes out in Andrew's work, of course. And today, I think our engagement, which is part of my day job, our engagement with fresh thinking, with academic communities, with think tanks, and making sure that the ideas that are out there are factored back into professional military education, an area in which I've worked for quite a number of years, and I'm passionate about, so that we have a virtuous circle of good grounding of ideas, of freshness of thought, of agility of mind, and then of those things being brought to the attention of the decision makers in our policy and strategy arenas, so they are informed of what is out there, I think is critical. And I can't think of a better way of doing that than going into texts such as Andrew's and others, and using it to inform what we do today. I'll finish by saying, in my time working in professional military education, even before Andrew's book, well before Andrew's book was published, we were using Corbett as a basis, but not necessarily just for the maritime environment. And I'm not a, I'll put my cards on the table, I'm not a huge fan of domains and multi-domain integration and so on. I think there is very little that is new under the sun, apart from naming of ideas. But we were using Corbett in other contexts. So there's a great piece of writing by an American naval officer, Corbett in Orbit. So applying Corbett to space, to the space domain or the space environment. And of course, there is so much to read into Corbett for use in our digital commons. And so as we look at the world today, I don't think the world today is a world that Corbett would immediately recognize if he parachuted back into it. But I think that he could pretty quickly dust off his ideas and apply them, and not just to the wet stuff in between the land, but to the other parts of the national security contexts that keep us operating in the way that we do. Does he have the foundation of the British way of war? I'm not sure, but I think that this is a fantastic book, and I think it's a great read for anybody who is interested in this topic and wants to take it forward and wants to make Britain and like-minded nations the strengths in the world that they could and should be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Captain Dr. Kevin Rowlands. I would like to encourage everyone to ask their questions. You can do so during the course of presentations. And now over to James Rogers.
Hello. Hello. Yes, so apologies for the technical hiccup there. Victoria and I are actually in the same room, so sometimes there's a little echoing and rebounding, but we've conquered that. I won't say too much more on Corbett himself. I think Andrew, Alessio and Kevin have all covered that well, and of course you should all read Andrew's book. I thought I'd use my few moments to discuss how some of the ideas that Corbett has may have been, in some ways, Alessio also did this, reflected in the integrated review. And that, I think, is an interesting development insofar as it reflects perhaps some of the fundamental ideas within the UK, within UK strategic circles more broadly, and maybe even reflecting to some extent Britain's geopolitical position as an island off the coast of a very large and historically influential continent. So I find it very interesting how some of the ideas that Corbett and also Andrew talked about earlier are reflected in the integrated review. For example, one of the things that Andrew said earlier was that Corbett was very interested in the idea of a kind of a negative order, not necessarily in the sense of being bad, but nonetheless in the sense of preventing powerful states, particularly those that are located on continents, from asserting their views and their principles and their political systems more generally over others, both in the continent but also beyond it. And one of the interesting developments in the integrated review is, I think, the movement away from the idea of a rules-based international order towards what the integrated review calls an open international order, and one where sovereignty, or British sovereignty as a national interest identified in that review, is held to be important. So this in some ways also reflects an understanding of the changing geopolitical situation as well in the world. That is to say, one that is moving away from the sort of relatively stable era that we saw in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War to one that's potentially more competitive, more dynamic, and where there is a great deal of potential instability, not only because of changes in distant areas of the world, such as the Indo-Pacific, distant at least to the UK, but areas that are increasingly connected to us because of the changing balance of power, both economic and strategic. I think another interesting development of the integrated review that's somewhat reflected in some of the thinking of Corbett's is on the importance of freedom of navigation. Of course, there was he had a great interest in sea lines of communications or maritime communication lines, and I think the contemporary interest in freedom of navigation, a point that was alluded to by the National Security Advisor at his speech in Manama last week, is also an interesting development. And it's interesting also to see that the UK has played and has been playing a fairly prominent role in trying to uphold that, whether it's in the Black Sea in relation to the unjust and illegitimate claims of Russia over Ukrainian territorial waters, or indeed even in the South China Sea, where China, as Andrew has stated in his previous book, Sea Power States, has attempted to, in a way, continentalize the South China Sea and turn it into a distant or an adjacent periphery of China itself. And I think there are two other interesting areas where there are some common themes between the general ideas that Corbett put forward and also the contemporary integrated review. And that is the movement towards a kind of plurilateralism, a flexibility in the way in which we interact with other countries in terms of diplomatic engagement, away from those primarily multilateral, fairly structured forms of relationship, towards engagements that are much more flexible, more on case-by-case basis or in relation to particular regions. And therefore, this is another, I think, area of similarity. And then finally, I think there is a kind of, and this is perhaps something that's reflected more generally in the UK, but I think something that we sometimes overlook, or at least we've become confused over, and that is that there is a kind of a different understanding of power. So in many continental countries, and I think this was also seen quite a lot in the Brexit debate, there was a lot of thinking that equates power with mass or size. If you're a big country, naturally you are a big power, and therefore you should be listened to. But the UK experience would suggest otherwise. It's not actually size that really matters. It's the ability to systematize different elements of power and use them effectively. Also to sort of have intensity as opposed to sheer size and mass. And I think this is another area where the integrated review places some prominence, particularly through the idea of Britain being a science and technology superpower. And I see that myself as being intrinsically connected to the country's position as a maritime power. Insofar as to be a maritime power, you need to develop capital-intensive capabilities in the form of warships and the entire infrastructure of naval reach. And I think, therefore, there is a great deal of similarity there as well. So I think those are my my reflections in this discussion, and I hope that paves the way, alongside what else has been said by the other speakers so far this evening, for your questions and the general discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James. And thank you so much to all our panelists for their wonderful presentations. We will now move to our Q&A session, but before we do so, I would like to ask a question myself and address it to Professor Lambert. So our panelists spoke quite extensively about the integrated review, and I would like to ask you, to what extent can Corbett's ideas be found in the integrated review, and also the concept of global Britain, in your view, Professor Lambert?
Right. Thank you very much for that session, and particularly for the question, Victoria. As I see it, the integrated review is the first attempt to consider a truly post-Cold War approach to British security going forward. We've been carrying legacy issues from the Cold War. We've only just got rid of the continental military commitments of the NATO era. And the assumption that British defense was best represented by soldiers was a reflection of that. The war, if it happened, was not going to be at sea, it was going to be on land. I remember back in the 1980s being told that the role of the Navy was out of area operations. And I said, what area? And the obvious answer was NATO. And of course, what did NATO do when the Cold War ended? It changed the area. So what was then out of area is now very much in area. So the world is moving, and it's high time, and the integrated review, I think, has largely done this, that we think very coherently about where we think we are, where we think we're going, and critically, what we can learn, not replicate, but learn by understanding past experience. And what Corbett is doing for his generation is saying, look, we're having a debate here. We've got an army that wants to go off and fight on the continent and not fulfill the functions of a British national maritime strategy in which sea control is the primary requirement. The army doesn't want to engage with that discussion. And so in 1914, when Britain goes to war, it doesn't have a national strategy. The army has an operational plan to go to France, but 5 divisions don't make a strategy. And the Navy is left without its amphibious strike force. The British Expeditionary Force was not built to go to the continent and fight continuous operations. It was a strike force. Its job was to be landed from the sea to achieve essentially maritime security tasks. These range from sacking and burning enemy dockyards to securing the coast of Belgium. The army was not interested in doing any of these because that would subordinate it to the Navy, and it was very insistent that the army should be the senior service. So the government failed, and this is where the integrated review is important. The government of 1910 to 14 failed to impose a coherent national strategy on the country, despite half the cabinet members being close personal friends of Julian Corbett. Many of them had read his book. In fact, the British Expeditionary Force was shaped by his History of the 7 Years' War. The Secretary of State for War used that book as the basis of future British strategic thinking. We would need a mobile, deployable expeditionary capability to back up sea control. That man was in the room when the army was allowed to go to France and separate itself from British strategy. And the payoff for that is that Churchill ended up sending the Navy to try and do a combined operations task in the Dardanelles. It was never going to work. But he had personally been responsible for sending the army to France, so there were no troops to send on the Dardanelles expedition. So the key to this is integrated review is putting back together again things that have been broken apart. The next stage is to find some way of preventing debates between the services becoming the preferred method of budget cuts imposed by the Treasury. The other great lesson of the 20th century is to look at the 1960s and see how the Treasury picked off first the Navy, cancelling the aircraft carriers, and then the Air Force's strike bomber programs, basically by feeding off the debates between the two services. The services need to realize that the enemy is not wearing a different uniform. They're sitting in the Treasury and they're just waiting for you to give away all of the goodies by setting up these battles. It's the Air Force that gets the carriers cancelled. It's the Air Force briefings that do that. And the Air Force then finds that their project gets crushed as well. We really have to learn from this. If defense wants to be organized, it has to be organized together. It has to be coherent, and it has to put forward something that everybody can understand as a national approach to these problems, not, well, the best answer is more of this or more of that. The best answer is something that's going to work and deliver effect. And in the 21st century, we don't have the luxury of thinking about having this kind of Navy or that kind of army. We need to think about having a national security policy which integrates all of those elements in the right balance to achieve the objectives we're setting. So if we're talking about global Britain, it's not accidental that the Prime Minister overruled the Secretary of State in appointing a new CDS. So for the first time in 20 odd years, we have an admiral as CDS, and that's an indication of a direction of travel. That's not a Navy takeover. That's an indication that national strategy is significantly more maritime than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And that's a direction of travel that we can date back to the 1990s. The 97 review that set up the carrier program is critical here. So this is a long process. Changing strategy doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't matter how clever Corbett is, his ideas are going to take time to percolate through. You know, those ideas will be read today and they'll be debated in classrooms tomorrow. And a few years down the line, they'll start to get into position papers. That's the kind of transition we're looking at. So we need these out there, but ultimately we've made a big start with integrated review. You know, it's a very positive start, but it's not the end of the process. This is a process. It's not a journey completed. It's a journey begun, and we need to see it in those terms. So well done for everybody involved in the integrated review, and let's look forward to making things more integrated next time, more coherent, and better able to do that thing which Kevin talked about. I think very important. We're going to be working with people who do not have the same strategic priorities that we do. Britain's strategic priorities are different. And if we're going to work with big allies and small allies, we need to understand that. The better we understand our own priorities and our own positions, the easier it is going to be to understand our allies and partners' positions and to integrate with them. This is what Britain did historically. The British understood what the drivers were for every other ally, so that in the end game of the Napoleonic Wars, it's the British who are going around holding the Grand Alliance together by making timely concessions, by throwing some money into the pot, by offering deals, just to make everything smooth and efficient, because they put a huge effort into understanding the other side of the debate, not just the enemy, but the allies. The better you know your allies, the easier it is to keep the alliance going. And this is a point that Corbett is developing as well. So Corbett is talking about these things. He's looking at how the Grand Alliance of the First World War is shaping strategy. The end game at Gallipoli, everybody says, oh, they had to leave the Gallipoli Peninsula. They had to leave because the French pulled their troops out. It's really simple. And that was for domestic political reasons. So the French canceled that strategy in order to serve a domestic political agenda. Understanding the French better would have helped to resolve some of those problems. Clearly, we needed to get closer to the French to learn better how our allies were thinking and to anticipate some of those problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Andrew Lambert. We have a question from Simon Shelton, who's asking, what was Corbett's perspective of the 1921 Washington Conference, which amongst other things led to the end of the Anglo-Japanese alliance? Professor Patilano, I think this one is for you.
Thank you so much, Simon, for the question. It's an excellent question. And if I were to go back to some of the things in the book, and I'll leave to Andrew to correct me if I'm wrong on this. I think that Corbett is approaching this in a way, he's relatively suspicious about where the Americans are approaching the question of naval arms limitations. And quite rightly so, because as I say, Corbett doesn't see this in a question of an order in principle based on number of capabilities. The point that James was making, which I think is a really important point about the way Corbett is conceptualizing power, it's not just about the sort of like materialistic hard metrics of the number of ships and capital ships in particular. So the whole approach about how you regulate freedom of the seas and what we would call in the 1970s sea control and power projection. The Americans are approaching this from a numerical point of view, literally trying to constrain an environment and put shackles that would inevitably not benefit Britain, in which the Navy is a result of, if you want, that global trade supply chain system, which in turns fuels, funds, and creates a reasoning for the Navy. So in that sense, I think if Corbett had been around long enough to engage more fully with the process, I don't think he would have been happy the way things evolved, because the result of the naval treaties is exactly what he feared the most, which is a formal way to weaken the foundations of British maritime strength. Yeah. Now, within that context, and this is something that me personally, I find it very engaging, because when it comes to Japan, Corbett obviously writes what to the present day, I think is one of the most interesting, for a whole host of reasons, one of the most interesting pieces on combined operations during the Russo-Japanese War, and a piece of history in its own terms, insofar as the Russo-Japanese War is concerned. And so, during the time he's writing this, he receives confidential materials under the Anglo-Japanese alliance from the Japanese. He has interactions with the Japanese naval attaches here in London, who guide him through some of the materials that are being provided. So he certainly is exposed to the advantages of the Anglo-Japanese alliance. And we have to understand that by the standards of early 1900s, this is a real experiment. The Anglo-Japanese alliance doesn't have anything previously in the same sort of formal structures that is being provided at the time. So it's a really new thing for Britain as well. And so in that sense, Corbett is really experiencing what this alliance is bringing, and he's experiencing from his specific angle of improving his understanding of this particular experience, which he thought was very relevant to the way in which he approached the question of British combined operation, in particular, sort of the expeditionary stroke power projection amphibiosity element of British strategic thinking. But is he thinking in terms of naval agreements with an eye to the Anglo-Japanese alliance? I certainly don't get that sense, but then I haven't engaged the materials the way Andrew has. So I think there is an element of this question really only Andrew can answer at the moment. But certainly from my perspective, I don't think that he was looking at the problem of the naval arms limitation agreements in terms of what it would do to the Anglo-Japanese alliance. In part because he's key, Corbett is a man of his age. So if you put on two plates, it's like Anglo-Japanese alliance and empire and dominion and the transformation of empire to remain the fundamental concepts underpinning it. That it's not a bargain there. Obviously, empire and its transformation comes first. The Anglo-Japanese alliance is a very sort of tailored ad hoc type of arrangement. So in that sense, I don't think he ever saw it in relation of the alliance, and as a result of it, I think it's perhaps not a stretch of imagination to suggest that it was a price worth paying if that would have meant that the empire would have sort of evolved the way he thought would be best. Having said so, he still was not really happy with the way arms limitation agreements had been suggested by the Americans, because at heart he thought they would undermine, fundamentally cripple the way upon which the British sort of imperial system, and in particular the way the Navy was part of national strategy, was organized. But it's an excellent question, really lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Catalano. Professor Lambert, would you like to add anything?
Yes, briefly. Corbett sadly died just at the time when he would have been thinking about these things, and his work was dominated by getting Volume 3 of Naval Operations past the first Sea Lord, who wished to squelch it and wrote a very nasty foreword. In fact, the nasty foreword was written by Roger Keyes, and the grammar was improved by Winston Churchill, both of whom had axes to grind against Corbett by that stage. What Corbett was doing in 1921-22 was assisting with the writing of strategic analysis of the possibilities of an Anglo-American war. He was writing about the strategic impact the Panama Canal would have on a potential Anglo-American war. Not that he was expecting one, But having seen how the Americans behaved at the Versailles Conference, this was certainly a realistic possibility. America was hostile. The Americans wanted more of the world's trade. They wanted to break down the Sterling Zone. They wanted to break open the empire. And the Washington process and the end of the Anglo-Japanese alliance was certainly, in that sense, an advantage. The other thing to remember about Washington is the British were short of cash. And so a parity deal pro tem with the Americans, not in perpetuity, pro tem with the Americans looked like a good bet. On the other side, the American Navy was losing support politically and was never going to get to build its 1918 warship construction program, which was the thing the Americans were giving away at the conference. So the Americans were exchanging a future they couldn't have for an alliance the British had, and for some old but still serviceable British capital ships. So I think the Americans did get the best of the deal, and America was able to use the deal to retreat into isolationism. The Republican government that signed the deal was isolationist. Internationalism in America had been defeated when Woodrow Wilson couldn't get the League of Nations through Congress. So it is problematic. And it allows the Americans to keep their distance from the major flashpoints of the world, both in Asia and in Europe. And it's not until December 1941 that Japan forces the Americans to join the Second World War, shortly followed by Hitler, who declares war on them as well for no particularly good reason. The Americans weren't coming into the Second World War until they were dragged kicking and screaming. On the 6th of December 1941, America was isolationist. It was not interested in the war in Europe and didn't see any reason to get involved in Asia either. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers changed their minds, and they've not really recovered from that since. So I think Corbett would have read that as Alessio suggested. Britain didn't get the best deal here, but economically, Britain is not in a strong position. Technically, Britain is. If Britain had carried on building, the British had actually completely overwhelmed the American advantage of more modern ships with a new generation of capital ships that would have transformed the strategic situation. But they were very expensive. So it's a trade-off. Do you try and maintain absolute superiority at enormous cost when you have no money, or do you temporize with a power you don't see as an immediate threat? And I think that the balance probably is that was the right decision, but the outcomes weren't necessarily as good as they might have been. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lambert. Another question is from Nathan Wilson, and he's asking, how do you think Corbett would approach today's Britain's maritime ambitions alongside Quad nations in the Indo-Pacific? Captain Dr. Kevin Rowlett, would you like to answer this one?
I would. I think that, and again, Andrew can correct me when I go wrong on this one, but I think Corbett would be far more comfortable and familiar with the British approach now in the Indo-Pacific than he would have been a few years ago with our military adventurism in other parts of the world, or even in the height of the Cold War and looking at NATO versus the Warsaw Pact and the continental sort of superpowers facing off against each other. I think that. Again, this comes out in the book, doesn't it? That how connected and influential Corbett was, and the circles in which he moved. So Mackinder is a friend and a colleague, and Mackinder's view of the world, and then later Spikeman and so on. Those maps of the heartland and the periphery and the rimland and so on would be extremely familiar and comfortable to Corbett. It would be how he viewed the world. Corbett, as Andrew tells us, his version of the Grand Tour was into India, not across the continent looking at paintings. So that part of the world I think he would be familiar with. And if we look at the Quad, of course, half of the Quad in Corbett's day would have been indirectly ruled from Whitehall. So I think he would be comfortable, familiar, and supportive of the way that Britain is approaching that part of the world today, given the paucity of assets and the other requirements that the British have today.
Yep.
Thank you. James, would you like to add anything?
Thank you, Victoria. No, I think Kevin summed up that very well. I mean, it's always very difficult to try to think about how someone from a very sort of different period in time with a different set of geopolitical sort of variables would respond to the time in question. But I think generally he would be favourable to closer British engagement with those countries. I think he would look at their objectives as being very similar to those of a maritime power. That's to say, to uphold a free and open Indo-Pacific and uphold freedom of navigation. And I suspect he would want to see the UK, if not at the table with them, insofar as it's a quad and not a quint at the moment, would also favour other forms of cooperation, potentially alignment, like, for example, AUKUS, which draws the UK closer to two of the quad powers without actually being part of the framework itself, but also the bilateral cooperation that's being undertaken with Japan, and that's deepened quite significantly over the last 10 years. And of course also with India. So I think he would want to see the UK as close as possible to those countries and assisting and helping them in their endeavours, although there are some differences sometimes in the way they do it, but generally in upholding a free and open Indo-Pacific.
Thank you, James. And Professor Lambert, would you like to add anything?
Only briefly to point out, I think something that struck me as I was working on the book. Corbett's ideas are being consumed by the brand new Royal Australian Navy. The Royal Navy team that went out to get the Australian Navy up to speed before their new ships arrived, they'd all been through the Naval War Course. They were all Corbett students. He knew them all. And the ideas of the early Australian Navy are deeply reflective of British practice. The United States Navy at the Naval War College at Newport, Rhode Island, they immediately recognized Corbett's work, and by the outbreak of the First World War, they are the main buyers of some principles of maritime strategy. That book went out of print in 1918 because the Americans had bought all of them. And the second edition of 1918 is printed in Boston because there wasn't print capability in Britain at the time. And the British pages are sent across the Atlantic on an American cruiser, courtesy of the Commander-in-Chief of the American Navy in Europe, William Sowden Sims, who is a great friend of Corbett's and a follower of his ideas. So his thinking resonates across many of the organizations that we're looking at here and has done from the beginning. So he's there at the foundation of the Royal Canadian Navy. Another one of his students from the War Course is the founding admiral of the Royal Canadian Navy, Charles Kingsmill. So he's even in Canada when the tercentenary of Quebec is celebrated with a massive naval display on the St. Lawrence. So he's heavily involved in creating this partnership. He's working with the Americans. He's working very closely with the Australians and the Canadians. And these people are turning up on the war course. Australian Army officers are turning up, and latterly naval officers from Australia and Canada. So he's heavily involved in this imperial, evolving world of education. And you can find his impact. I was recently in Kingston, Ontario, a couple of years ago, and it's there. You can find it in the Royal Military College of Canada. So he's making a difference. And the kinds of partnerships that we're looking at now, these are things that Edwardian Britain is doing. The relationship with America isn't as close as it is today, but it is there. The British and the Americans are agreeing on things. They're agreeing to divide up roles and missions. The Caribbean is no longer a place where the British need a powerful fleet because they've accepted that the Americans can run that region, despite the presence of many British imperial outposts. the British are making concessions, doing deals, and balancing out the world. Because after 1900, the main focus of their strategic concern is Imperial Germany. But after 1918, what happens? The British go back to the kind of position we're looking at today, a dispersed fleet operating globally, picking out regions where there are problems to be solved, and adjusting the balance to meet the emerging threats. So once you get rid of the German threat, the new world order after 1919 is different. It's more dispersed, more diffuse, and then it comes back together again as we teeter down towards the Second World War. So it's flexibility. There are no fixed plans. We're meeting circumstances, we're addressing problems. As Japan goes from being an ally to being a potential enemy, really big issues. And you can see all of that happening. And the men who are making those decisions all went through the war course before the First World War. So if you look at some of the great men of the Second World War, Bertram Ramsay, student of Corbett, he has a lasting legacy. Long after his death, his ideas are still there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lambert. And also Mr. Wilson is thanking all of you for your answers to his question. The next question is from James London, and he says that Professor Lambert makes a fascinating and current point. As a former Army officer of some 37 years, there remains a deep inter-service rivalry, which harms a critical need for a full and necessary defense integration. Is there any realistic hope that a truly integrated defense posture will be feasible by the respective services? And can any defense secretary knock senior officer heads together to resolve these faults? Well, that's a very interesting question. Captain Dr. Kevin Rowlands, would you like to take this one?
Yeah.
No. Okay then. It's interesting. So inter-service rivalry, healthy competition, supportive friends and allies. I've got this will sound like a completely sort of cop-out answer, but it's actually true. For a couple of years, I was the secretary to the Chiefs of Staff Committee. I worked with the heads of the services, the senior officials in the Ministry of Defence. It is the most collegiate, supportive working organisation I think I've come across. I've seen more mutual respect and support amongst the different services at the senior levels than I probably have within the Royal Navy between its various branches. So it's not something I think it's something that we often sort of giggle about and talk about. And of course, there is always a battle for money. That's slightly different. But I think the story of the past 3/4 of a century has been a steady centralization of decision making and power within UK defence. So, from single service ministries to the Ministry of Defence, from chiefs of service with real power to a CDS, and then really from a lack of power in some ways on operational matters by the military, and crossing over the road to the other side of Whitehall with a National Security Council and a National Security Advisor. So centralising, and all of those mean that it isn't the Navy, the Army, the Air Force that make great decisions about what they're doing. They argue the case, they fight the corner, they do so fully in the knowledge that they can't fight alone, and they make a stronger defence together. And then those decisions are taken by informed officials and politicians based on the evidence that they've got. So yes, there's great competition. It's very friendly, but I think it is a pretty good collegiate environment that we work in. And that's not a cop-out answer. That's actually true.
Thank you so much, Captain Dr. Kevin Rowlands. We have another question from Dr. Hunter. He would like to congratulate Professor Andrew Lambert on his new book, and he has the following question. Professor Andrew Lambert, do you consider the integrated review part of a changing strategy or making the point of grand strategy?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Hunter. That's a splendid question, and many thanks for your congratulations. The integrated review is a process, and I think that's the best way to look at it. We have to see this not as a way station on a progress, and in the next 5 years, things might change. That direction of travel we can identify now, which is towards the global and the maritime. It's not overwhelming, but it's clear. The world might change. There are flashpoints in Eastern Europe that might transform the way we see security and strategy in the next 5 years. Hopefully they won't. But getting the right policy outcomes as Britain moves from one set of economic and political relations to another is always going to be difficult, but it's a great opportunity. The fixity of the Cold War was terrifyingly dull for strategic thinking. Here were the Russians, here were the NATO allies, there was the flashpoint, and we could even map out the ground they would fight on. Early in my career, I was teaching the soldiers who were in Germany waiting for the war to start on the captain's staff course. Poor devils, they were bored rigid. They had nothing to do. They were just sitting waiting for something to happen. And I was teaching them when it became clear that nothing was going to happen. And 6 months later, they were in Iraq fighting. So the world changes quite quickly. So we can see this as part of a process, but we have to be clear that events are always going to come along and disrupt the smooth flow of policymaking. So yes, progress in a direction which I think is more appropriate to the current state of the country, but we mustn't see that as in any way putting us on a track to a fixed terminal point. There isn't one. It's a constant evolution. And the point Kevin was making is critical. We need an informed and intelligent debate about strategy, and that has to be between the politicians who will have to take responsibility for it and the service leaders and service personnel who are going to have to deliver it. And the better that conversation is, the better informed both sides of the debate are about methods, aims, means, outcomes. You know, the politicians have to be able to tell the services what they want done, and the services have to be able to tell them what they can possibly achieve. And they have to find some way of compromising. This is one of the things that Corbett writes about, and I think he writes about this brilliantly in his book on the 7 Years' War. The strategic partnership between Prime Minister William Pitt the Elder, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Admiral Lord Anson, and General Ligonier in the War Office. These are men who are sitting around a table and conversing as the experts in the room, and they are setting strategy, and they're then, in the case of the Admiral and the General, translating it into operations. And that's what we're looking for, that kind of seamless process, one of mutual respect, which is built up over some time. And if we can achieve that, we will be in a much better place than we were in 1914, when the two services were literally not talking about strategy. There was no conversation about national strategy between the Admiralty and the War Office in 1914. So the fact that there is such a conversation now within the MOD structure is a very big positive. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lambert. It is already almost 7:30 p.m. and unfortunately our event has come to an end. But we have many more questions left, and I'm sure that Professor Andrew Lambert will be very delighted to answer those. So we will try to share them with him, and hopefully we can get answers from Professor Lambert shortly, and we can then share those answers with you. Today we had a wonderful opportunity to hear from Professor Lambert himself, who brilliantly guided us through his wonderful new book, The British Way of War. And we would like to encourage everyone to get your own copy. Now we have some good news. Our colleague John will be sharing an email with you later this evening with further information about the book and a special discount code. So make sure that you get your own copy tonight. Thank you so much once again for all the panelists for joining us tonight, and also for all the attendees actively engaging in the conversation and in the Q&A session. I would like to sincerely thank you all for your time, and we will be bringing many more interesting events on geostrategic issues in the upcoming weeks. You can check the upcoming events on our website, www.geostrategy.org.uk, and you can also subscribe to our events notifications on our website. Thank you so much for taking part, and we are looking forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you. Brilliant.